Hi, Professor Charlie Evans here, and I'd like to talk a little bit about medieval Japan. And the first thing I'd like to say is that it's we really can't use the adjective medieval when we're talking about East Asian history from the 10th through the 13th centuries. Even though that corresponds to the medieval period of European history, the characteristics and features that defined medieval Europe are really not present in East Asia in this period of time. And so, in this respect, medieval is really just a chronology. It really just refers to a time period. Um, Clearly, the dominant force or state or player in East Asia in this period of time is China, and this corresponds to the Tang and Song dynasties. China had re-centralized control after a period of warring factions, and so it was a powerhouse again. It was a central empire, and because it was so large, it tended to dominate the surrounding areas. And so Chinese cultural, religious, economic, and military influences were paramount in Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, to greater or lesser extent in all three of these areas. Looking at the map, you see that Japan is off the coast of Korea, and so it was never directly invaded by China in this period of time, whereas both Vietnam and Korea had been invaded by Chinese armies. And because of the proximity of Korea and Vietnam to China, Chinese influence was correspondingly greater there than it was in Japan. But Chinese influence was still really significant in Japan. Uh, China was a major trade partner of Japan, um, and the Chinese political system was a role model for Japan, and Japan and certain families and figures in Japan would have liked that the political system of Japan was more resembled China, but that wasn't really the case. In Japan, the emperor tended to be more of a ceremonial figurehead, whereas in China, the emperor was really all powerful. In Japan, uh, key families really were the ones that wielded political and economic control of the territories. And one of the things you see that's different about Japan and China, China is one single land country, whereas Japan is a series of islands linked together, and that made communication and trade a little bit more different than what existed in China. Um, like I said, the emperor tended to be more of a figurehead in Japan. And the other interesting thing about Japan is that while Japan did adapt some characteristics of Confucian and Buddhist traditions from China, it still remained loyal to the religion of Shinto, an indigenous, that's a very difficult word, indigenous religion that's centered on ancestor worship and uh, the veneration of certain nature spirits. And the last thing was that, as I mentioned, there was significant Chinese influence in Japan. Um, Young men, boys learned Chinese classical works. Um, they tended to conduct business and their record keeping in Chinese, and literary works were written in Chinese. So, like, China had a really influential impact on China. But because Japan retained its own religious foundations, and because of this kind of difference in the role and function of the emperor, Japan tended to remain a far more decentralized political state than China was, and Japan tended to retain far more of its own native traditional culture under the influence of China. And so, towards the end of the 12th century, an important family emerged as the real political power in Japan. This was the Minamoto clan, and while the emperor still retained ceremonial and figurehead power residing in Kyoto, it was really the Minamoto clan through the office of the shogun. The shogun was the military governor who ruled, who really ruled Japan, who de facto ruled Japan in place of the emperor. The shogun was the real ruler of Japan, and the center of the shogunate was in Kamakura, and so this period of Japanese history is called the Kamakura period, which would be later followed by the Tokugawa. And so it was a decentralized rule with power in the hands of the Minamoto family. Okay, thanks.